Good day. Today, I would like to share with you about the impact of crime on victims and victims' families. As you know, I already shared with you that the restorative justice process focuses on three areas, which is the offender who committed the crime, the victims of crime, and in the case of murder, the victim's family, and also the community. But I want to share with you a few thoughts about the impact of victims during the crime and also the aftermath and what happens many years after the crime was committed while the offender is incarcerated. And so I trust that you will give me some input after this talk that we can dialogue the best practice for victim empowerment and victims. Dr. Howard Zeh is saying that it's so easy for us only to see something the way we see it. Now, Dr. Zeh is a very prominent writer in the field of restorative justice, and he also directs the Mennonite Central Committee in the USA. He's a consultant, editor, and writer. Now, Dr. Hare speaks about the need for us to see justice through a different lens and describes restorative justice as a justice that heals. So we can't just work with the offender. We can't just take the offender through a rehabilitation process without the victims or the victim's family, without their input, without supporting the victims of crime, empower the victims of crime, should they feel at one stage that they are strong enough to confront the offender with more questions, to get answers for their unanswered questions that they did not get in the courts, because many offenders, unfortunately, almost up till 65% of offenders, they pleaded not guilty, although they were found guilty, but they tried to get away with it. This is what they're telling us. So they come through a restorative justice process, and they are now also ready to give the victims the truth. But we need to empower the victims. We need to support the victims. We need to share with the victims also what is their rights and what opportunities is there for them. And so I want to share that with you today, and I trust that we will have a great time. We need to understand the impact of victimization. That is why it is important for us to understand the impact of crime on victims and their families. And what is the process that we need to consider in terms of victim support and victim empowerment? And one of the real issues is that the victims reacting are universal. Doesn't matter what country the victims are in, what crime was committed, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in the USA or in Europe or in Great Britain, the victims has the same reaction. It's universal. And that is why we can learn from one another, but it is important that we do not make ourselves guilty with victimization. Never forget the trauma of the victims and the victims' families. Yes, we do get the reports that the offenders is changing through the rehabilitation process, through therapy. They go through psychotherapy, they go through other processes, spiritual care. All these programs and processes are available to them, and we also experience the genuine change of offenders. There are many offenders that we experience with a genuine change that did not change because they want parole. They really change because they realize also the impact of crime, especially when we spend 6 hours with a group of offenders on the second day of the restorative justice process, sharing with them the impact of crime, bringing victims in, not directly involved in their case, but other victims that come and share with them the impact of the crime. We had rape victims, we had victims' families whose families was murdered, we had people involved in armed robbery, we had people that is now in a wheelchair. They come to share and the offenders change. But we must never forget the impact of the victims and the victims' families. So with the mind and the idea that the offenders do change behind bars, because there is a thorough process that they're going through. Obviously, if they want to do that voluntary, the process is to their availability, but with their changing, it doesn't just overshadow the impact of the crime on the victims and the victims' family. So we must never forget that. The second thing is that we always teach our offenders also that don't use excuses like poverty and drugs and alcohol as the reason for you committing that crime. Because all of us know already the devastation and the impact of alcohol abuse and drug abuse and the consequences of that. So it is also insensitive to tell the victims' families that it's because of drugs and alcohol and poverty or peer pressure even that I got involved in this case. So we're looking at all these areas to help the offender also to understand the impact of the crime on the victims and the victims' families. To give you two examples, we had a case where a gentleman just came home and he stopped and he saw two people robbing his neighbor, and they already had the firearm in a mouth. And he was so shocked, but also traumatized. And in that shock, he jumped out of his car. He ran to the crime scene and he wanted to know, what are you doing? And before he could get an answer from them, the response of them was, they shot him. And he is now in a wheelchair for 20 years. And he's saying, if that people were caught and sentenced, they might have get away with 15 years. And he is already 20 years in a wheelchair. But they didn't even find the guys. The other case is a rape victim that shared also and said that when you rape, when you pull up your zip, you never realize that you're leaving behind and you're turning your back on a disaster. Because many rape victims, their lives become so traumatized. They can't deal with the trauma of that rape. They can't deal with the emotions. They can't deal with men that took it for granted that they can just come and penetrate them and walk away, and being so disrespectful. And so this lady challenged them. And I'm telling you that we saw hardened criminals. We saw many men that were sentenced for rape. They came right in front of these ladies, and they will tell them, I'm a rapist. And what I heard from you as rape victims, I just want to say I'm so sorry that I got involved in crime like this. So it is important that even the offenders have to understand the impact of crime. I do quite a lot of reading in terms of justice and restitution and healing and deliverance and also reconciliation. And I just have a few books in front of me that I just want to point out, where do I get the facts from. The very first book is the Bible, the Word of God, that I use constantly during my research and during the times that I'm reading other books. I will always come back to the Word of God. Then I also have the handbook on justice for victims, a very powerful tool, and this was issued by the United Nations Office for Drug Control and Crime Prevention. And this is really a very, very interesting document, and it is a must read when people are involved in restorative justice, when it comes to offenders, victims, and the community. Then I also have the very latest 2020 restorative justice programs, the second edition. This is the handbook on restorative justice, also issued by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Very, very interesting tool to have. And being involved for the last 22 years in restorative justice and reading this handbook, we can say that we feel proud to be on board on restorative justice, and we follow many of these instructions also that was written by other professionals as well. And then I have another book here written by Reverend Jim Considine from New Zealand, Restorative Justice, Healing the Effects of Crime. Also a very powerful book, and also many information in terms of restorative justice. Then I've got a book here by Kirk Blackhard, Restoring Peace, also helpful in terms of restorative justice. And then also a book that was forwarded by the Reverend Desmond Tutu, written by Father Michael Lapsley, a powerful man of God that shares about redeeming the past, my journey from freedom fighter to healer. And so this was also very helpful. And then in terms of the mindset of people, I found this book of Tim LaHaye, Mind Siege, also very helpful. This is just a few of the books that I use over the years to get my information from. And I'm very excited to be part of this restorative justice and victim-offender dialogue process. One of the areas that we found very interesting is when we share with the offenders the impact of crime and the ripple effect of crime. That is always something that we can't really understand, that the majority of offenders that goes through the restorative justice process telling us they never realized that the impact of their crime was so huge. They thought it's just them and their victim, and if the victim is dead, they can just move on with their lives. But when we deal with the ripple effect of crime, they start to realize that the crime that they committed affected actually more people. It is not just the direct victim, and in the case of murder, it is also the victims' families, but also the offenders' families as well. And we are bringing in the offenders' families onto this restorative justice process. And the families will come on the 6th day of this process to come and share with the offenders face to face how their crime affected them as family members as well. Very powerful statements being made, very emotional, but very helpful for the offenders to hear from their own families also how the crime impacted their lives as well. So this is also helping the offender to understand what the direct victims and the direct victims' family are going through when they listen to their own families. And then there is also the community at large that are also affected by this, because the communities right across the world are really frustrated about crime. They really want the justice systems in all countries and the police to really look at the criminal justice process, because the retributive justice process does not work. So we have to look at a justice that heals. But we go further than that in terms of the ripple effect of crime. We pointing out to them that the police that goes to the crime scenes, they are also affected by this crime. And they don't realize that because they're just looking at police to arrest people, but they don't know unless they hear the impact of crime on police who became alcoholics, who had to go to some kind of mental institution and had to go through some kind of therapy as well and counseling for the trauma that they experience on the crime scene as well. And then there is the ambulance staff that also need to remove the body, the forensics, and the photographer of the police, the people working at the mortuary, and so many people. The correctional officials, they're not standing on the stoop of correctional centers and calling people into correctional centers. They have to accept what they receive from the courts. They've got no choice who to choose to come into their correctional centers. So they have to accept anybody, doesn't matter what their behavior was before and how they will behave in the center. They have to accept them. And they are also affected by this crime of the offender. So it is a huge ripple effect, and we need to bring that under their attention as well, so that they can understand it is not just to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it again. There must be genuine remorse, and they also need to give what the victims want, and we're going to come to that now. So the very first area is what victims experience. And if offenders doesn't understand that victims experience disempowerment, they experience loss of safety, they experience the disrespect, they experience the challenges of how the crime was committed and the behavior of the offender, that's why they won't trust them easy. They will always be suspicious if they have to see these people again. So that is why correctional services is now making sure before they will approve parole that they will still engage with the victims or the victims' families in the case of murder, because there are so much trauma when they just release people in the past and the victims find these people on the streets and didn't even know about that. And so the process is very helpful for the victims as well. And then also the loss of control of their feelings and their emotions. It's very, very sad. You remember I spoke to you at the last clip, and you can check it again on YouTube on Jennifer Chadburn, that even after 28 years, he will still remember the day that her father was murdered on the 16th of February. And she will remember her father's birthday. She remembers him during Christmas times and family gatherings 28 years later. So victims experience these things, and many victims are healed. Many rape victims are healed. It is very, very exciting to know that many rape victims will say, I'm not a victim. I overcame this challenge, and I'm moving forward, and I'm not going to allow offenders to hold me back because of what happened. I'm victorious in my way forward. And that is wonderful, but victims experience many challenges. The feelings of the victims, offenders also need to know, and we need to be sensitive in terms of their feelings, because their rights were violated. The fear that they experience, the shock, the humiliation, the frustration that they experience, and the anger for not having that control over that situation at given time, and being upset also. Many times victims feel so guilty. Why didn't I close the windows? Why didn't I put on the alarm? Why did I go out that time of the evening? And they even upset with themselves and blame themselves for what happened to them as well. And obviously also very sad and very bitter towards the people that hurt them so brutally, or their loved ones. And then very important that we want everybody to know, and what we teach the offenders as well, and we want victims to know, and victims need to make contact with us, because we can help victims in terms of support, in terms of empowerment. And if victims really want to get involved first with the counseling and empowerment and support, and if they ever feel ready to confront the offender, arrangements can be made. And I can say today that the Department of Correctional Services is open for this process here in South Africa. So what victims want, number one, what victims want truthful answers. And if victims can get truthful answers that they never get before, not even in court, that is very helpful. We had a case that I don't want to identify the case, but the lady said to me and the head of the center that she just want 10 minutes with the offender to tell him in his face he must rot in this place. And I said to the head of the center, and I said to this lady, if this is what you want to tell the offender, we will let you engage with the offender, because the offender is ready to meet with you and your family. 2 hours later, she jumped up and asked, can I give him a hug? Why? Because he gave us the truth. The puzzle is now completed for the truth that he just gave us now. And that was so helpful for the family. So truthful answers is a step in the right direction. Then secondly, what victims want, they want offenders to take full responsibility for the crime. As I said, no excuses about poverty, peer pressure, alcohol and drugs. They need to realize that somehow their lives was also messed up. They never took responsibility to equip themselves with life experiences and having this resilience against all odds of life. And they dropped out of school, they got involved with gangsterism, and their behavior became unacceptable. And if they can start to point that out to the victims of crime or their family, that we did not work on our behavior in the past, and we're taking full responsibility for the crime, but we're also taking full responsibility to go through this rehabilitation process, never to hurt people again, but also take full responsibility again to give that answers that the victims really want. And the third area that victims want, they want to be empowered again. Now, I'll give you another example that we had a situation where a guy, he murdered this woman's son, and in the victim offender dialogue process, and when she got all her answers and dialogue with this guy, and she said to him that you were a very evil person outside, and you were involved in gangsterism when you were out in the community. Now, I want you to do something for me. When you come out, I want you to come to my house very often, that you can show to your gangster friends how remorseful you are for killing my son. And then you can also show them that with the truthful answers that you gave me, taking full responsibility, I forgave you because I experienced your remorse. And this is fourthly what victims also want to to know and experience the true and genuine remorse of the offender. But for any judge or any prosecutor or even any legal person, it is very interesting. This is not just for South Africa, because we have people that are involved in crime from many different communities, drug-infected communities, people coming from homes where there's no loving father figure as a positive role model, there is inadequate mothers, there is poor parenting, and all that and so on. And it's very interesting. Sometimes it brings a smile to my face, this the way the offenders tells us, saying that the judge said that I've got no remorse. I don't even know what remorse is. What is the meaning of remorse? They don't even understand this concept. And I think that people also need to help offenders also to understand the legal concepts. That you just don't take it for granted if you say, you show no remorse, and many of the offenders is saying, I don't even know what is the meaning of remorse. But if we explain it to them, and we do explain it to them in depth about the genuine remorse is to be so heartbroken and sorry for what you did, not because you were caught, but for what you did and the impact of your crime, that you will turn your back on any evil, any gangsterism, whether it's in prison or whether it's outside, and you will make sure that you will go through a therapy process, that your behavior will change, that you will live according to your religion. And if your religion requires from you a change of heart, a change of mind, that you can say one day, it is well with my soul because I am sorry for what I did, and I ask the victims to forgive me, and I even ask God to forgive me. So that is also areas that help the victim and empower them also not to be so fearful when this person comes out. So true remorse is important. And then this forms part of what victims also want, restitution. So you can't always, and in our country, in South Africa, although one of the victims' rights is compensation from government, it's one of the victims' rights in our constitution, but the government don't have the money to pay victims because there is so many victims in our country, and offenders do not have the money to compensate the victims. But what can they do in terms of restitution? Give the victims the truth. Take full responsibility and let the victims experience your true remorse, turning away from your evil. And then is something that is very, 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 very sad if we know in terms of the victim's anger that it is a reality that it's not all victims that will forgive offenders, because the trauma and the brutality of the crime and the attitude of the offender, and many victims will say to us how offenders treat them in court, and how offenders will make remarks, and how offenders will even really threaten them. That's why many victims don't want to come to court, because their lives is in danger. And so it is not that easy for victims just to forgive offenders. But we trust that the restorative justice process will at least help the offender, as I said, to understand what victims experience, the feelings of the victims, and what victims want from them, so that they can, at a later stage, to consider what they're going to do with that information. We had a lady that was in the police force, and she shot two police people, two of her colleagues. The one was the father of her unborn child and his other lover. And she went into this room and she pulled the firearm and shot the guy, but he survived, but the woman died. And this victim's mother came to confront her in a victim offender dialogue process. And then, after 4 times saying to this offender, the mother said to her, I will never forgive you. She said that 4 times. She said it. I will never forgive you because you left my grandchild as an orphan, because her father is not part of her life and my daughter is not there because you took my daughter's life. I will never forgive you. The offender's response was to her, ma'am, if you look in my file of restorative justice, you will see there I wrote my expectations of this victim offender dialogue. And my expectation was not for you to forgive me. I wanted to listen to what you went through and what you are still going through. I want to listen to your pain so that I can carry your pain with me, because I realized that there was other alternatives other than using another colleague's firearm to kill your daughter. And I'm sorry for that. And then the mother of the victim concluded and said, you know what, you're such a beautiful lady. I'm going to ask God to help me to forgive you. And that was powerful. So we do not expect victims to forgive, but we do require from the offenders to be sensitive to the victim's experience, feelings, and what they want, and also to recognize their anger. So if they don't forgive, that the offenders won't say, what's the use of going through this process? What's the use of doing restorative justice and being involved in other therapy programs and being involved with the social workers and the psychologists and even the criminologists? What's the use of being involved in this if people don't have to understand the impact of crime on the victims and the community and your own family and even on yourself? And then also, lastly, that some victims might take revenge, and we had that many times, and that is very sad. And so we want rather victims to get on board. So victims of crime and family members of victims, I trust that you will get on board with us, make contact with us. If you have any questions, we will be there to advise you. We will be there to give you emotional and moral support, and we will empower you as a way forward, and you don't have to fear the fact that your perpetrator or your family member's perpetrator will be released one day and you don't know what to do. Let us prepare you, even if it's 5, 10 years from now. Let us prepare you as a way forward. Come on board and we will definitely assist you where we can. We're having an experience of 22 years on this journey, so we trust that we will hear from you soon. Thank you very much.